thanks again for this wonderful workshop, which is a good break for me from the whole marking crush that I often find myself in the month of May. So what I'm going to be presenting today is a book chapter in a forthcoming volume, Handbook of Social Change. It's edited by Clive Barnett, who unfortunately passed away at a very young age in December last year, and a wonderful colleague from South Africa, Richard Bartlett. And what is perhaps unique about this chapter, and it's the same title as the title of this talk, Ecologies of Infrastructure, Materialities of Metabolic Change, is that it emerges out of a pedagogic inquiry involving a 10-day intensive Sheret-like architecture design studio that I conducted into an infrastructure project in Chennai, a southern Indian city. So Chennai's 62-kilometer outer ring road, which is the one that's marked in the bold red here, was built in two phases between 2009 and 2021. But it's a long pending road infrastructure project which was first conceived in 1970s as a part of the city's then modernization and development strategy involving a first master plan that was prepared in 1975. It was a simple enough idea of decongestion using traffic principles of ring roads, radial routes, etc. Initially, it got deferred back to the back burner on the advice of the same consultants who had suggested it in the first place. The outer ring road has nevertheless remained in the imaginary of the city planners as it found renewed favor in the 21st century when public and private interests converged in mega infrastructure projects. And this is where I think it overlaps with Marco's reference to temporality and transitioning, and the idea of infrastructure and time comes into play very closely here. So the ORR, as built 50 years later, and I'll say ORR, which is the Outer Ring Road, it's a massive 122-meter wide road and rail corridor covering an area of 860 hectares, built at a cost of $380 million US, raising questions over whether its scope matches current economic actuality or necessity, despite its aim of promoting higher capacity and speed. With 5 bridges, 8 underpasses, 3 interchanges, 18 pedestrian subways, 3 flyovers, and hundreds of box culverts, it portrays a visual paradigm that is based on a slightly different technopolitical imaginary of infrastructure and grand solutions. There were, however, serious consequences to the realization of this space of unimpeded circulation, as witnessed during the devastating 2015 floods, when the completed first phase of the ORR proved to be an unmitigated ecological disaster. Settlements and villages on either side of the ORR were submerged to unforeseen levels, and you can see that on the picture here. There was loss of innumerable lives and property, with some surrounding areas registering record numbers of deaths. And these are very little known settlements in the peripheries of the city that nobody would have known about. So like the settlement right on either side here is known as Mudichure, which caught the headlines because it was one of the highest number of deaths recorded during the flooding. As an overbuilt and seemingly underutilized infrastructure project, little attention has been paid to the fact that the circulatory regime of this infrastructural object would drastically disrupt its surrounding ecological system. It was mainly because it tampered with the watershed of the 3 rivers, and you can see them marked in blue here, that flow through the metropolitan area: Adayar River to the south, Kuvem in the middle, and the Kosataleyar River in the north. Amidst an increasing frequency of seasonal flooding that is not just about water clogging or poor drainage, the 2015 floods highlighted the extent to which the ORR adversely affected the hydrology of the region, one that came to be irrevocably connected to this particular mode of infrastructural urbanism. Before the 2015 floods, there was a little understanding of the ORR cutting through a swath of peri-urban hinterland, whose reckless urbanism had already led to much ecological destruction. So even before this particular infrastructural remaking had meddled with the region's hydrology, the ecosystem in this area had been rapidly degrading with visible physical changes. Any sense of nature or ecology you encounter in this region is hardly of the bucolic kind. What you see is mostly scrublands, and their wetland geographies are often commonly portrayed as a wasteland. In Tamil, it's called as Poramboku, which is literally an antithesis to nature, one that has evolved as much by accident as by design, and that perhaps justified the reason why areas such as the neighborhood surrounding the outer ring road had been subject to the kind of unplanned urbanization over many decades, even before the ORR. So over the past decade, a groundswell of critical analysis, drawing on a diverse amalgam of theoretical frameworks, mainly from the social sciences, has focused on examining how infrastructure profoundly shapes the production, experience, governance, and transformation of social relations. And this is a wonderful set of literature John will be familiar with. Many of you who work on infrastructure will be familiar with in this room, and I'm not going to go into the summary of it. Eric Swingadoo, Matthew Gandy, and all geographers, anthropologists have worked on it. But as somebody who comes from a background of architecture, I do find that there's a kind of normative paralysis when you draw too much on social sciences, overtly critical analysis of infrastructure. So while highlighting the precarious and often annihilating relationships between landscape and infrastructure is crucial, simply harping on the discrepant realities of infrastructural objects and their tendency to ignore deep-seated concerns for ecological life is not enough. What I was looking for was something more productive. Thinking differently about infrastructure's physical world requires us to think ecologically, and so the studio that I undertook was this ecological reimagination of the ORR, one that is not limited to a simple sense of reinvoking the organic, but also engaging with its ontological primacy. So the ring road is there, what can we do with it, rather than just critique it. So for these purposes, instead of undertaking a usual social science investigation of the site, I chose to return to the design process, to find something that could be more mutually constitutive between infrastructures and their surrounding natures. There's of course a risk that by projecting the ORR as an ecologically reimagined entity, we might end up actually doing nothing against the object itself. But I thought that using the design studio for a pedagogic reinterpretation of the ORR might help in that context. Switching from geographical discourses, as I went to look into how architecture had dealt with infrastructure, I came across a wonderful body of work going back to the 1990s when scholars such as Gary Strang had written this. Again, this is in the Places Journal that Shannon Mattern had published her tree inventory piece. This is in 1999. Gary Strang wrote this thinking piece on infrastructure as landscape, where he talks about how architects are more optimistic about expressing utilities, buildings, and highways as legitimate components of a larger system. So for him, an architectural method that exploits the unignorable marriage between nature and technology provides an opportunity for new spatial and visual possibilities that result from using infrastructure as a fundamental component of architectural design. Nature and infrastructure working together must both be allowed to express themselves as a major determinant of urban and regional form, and it is up to architects, landscape architects, engineers, and biologists to show the way. Acknowledging the potential for appropriating infrastructure as landscape offers pragmatic and immediate advantages. And so, in this piece particularly, he talks about how we can produce urban designs that simultaneously solve utilitarian problems and help repair cities and regional landscapes at a scale not dreamed of since the days of the great dams. And so it was Gary Strang's piece that really influenced the work of Pierre Belanger, and his monograph was very instrumental in the way I organized the studio. His work, Landscape as Infrastructure, that draws from his own PhD, became a central reference to the studio that I organized, as he presents infrastructure as a polyvalent subject, bringing together a wide range of knowledge, again from the natural sciences, applied sciences, the arts, and design. Because for him, widening our engagement with infrastructure as a subject or an object of study is very crucial. And it underscores the role of landscape architects as central to these multilateral efforts, embracing a broader role of landscape, proposing the formulation of design through a process that is contingent, sometimes counterintuitive, preemptive and responsive, economic as well as ecological, systemic as well as projective. So it was about bringing the contradictions and the paradoxes together to the discussion and the drawing board. And so in this monograph, he makes a very interesting interjection about infrastructures, where he says that an ecological restructuring of urban infrastructure must include not just the management of water resources, waste recycling, energy generation, food production, but also tackle concerns of mobility, circulation of traffic, and the engineering interests. So for him, paramount to practice and pedagogy, infrastructure needs to be reintegrated and redefined as a sophisticated instrumental landscape of not just essential resources, processes, and services, but also one that collectively underpins and upholds the ongoing unfinished urbanization of 21st century. So, and this is what is quite interesting, and it goes back to what Marco had intuitively concluded, which is that you need to reinvent infrastructure as a live ecological system. And for that, contrarily, it needs to become an indeterminate form. And that is the biophysical processes of design. So instead of infrastructure being designed and conceived as a very finite object, it becomes an indeterminate interface of hard technological systems and soft biophysical processes by design. So this is just a quote from my book chapter, where I talk about how ecology has been invoked in this process. But one thing that I wanted to be clear about is that there is a strong trend within landscape design and architecture about ecological design processes, and that's not what I was looking at, because that is very much brief-oriented. And one of the things that I used in the architectural design process to facilitate a material rethinking of the ORR, to turn it into a different kind of cognitive object and know the region again, was to completely set aside the brief. So the first thing we did with the design studio was to say that there's no brief. We begin with the object without a brief. And so for that, we needed to use the ORR in a more discerning way of knowing or unknowing. And representing the region means that you need to unknow the infrastructure all over again. It was useful to remind ourselves that the discontinuities we encounter between infrastructure and landscape are not as objects per se, but rather between the context. So it's not infrastructure and nature as objects, but the context that creates these discontinuities. And this clarification might seem a little bit pedantic, but it is still valuable, as it encourages us to view their entanglements not as a double bind, but as a source of interaction where a contextual distinction is not always relevant. So if you go beyond this contextual distinction between infrastructure and nature, then multiple possibilities open up, and that's what we explored in the studio. So instead of a brief, I just posed a very simple question to the students, and I gave them a few cues. So the first question, and the major question, was that, can the ORR actively participate in producing a new kind of lived infrastructural ecology, where it becomes something indeterminate and opens up this realm of possibilities? And so without the brief, the studio became an undisciplined space for staging a radical post-humanist encounter. So for that, the situated practice of a design studio became a means of initiating, first of all, a material analysis of ORR as a living ecology. So some of the methodologies were quite orthodox. So you started with analysis, where you looked at the material analysis of ORR, encompassing a vibrant mix of its different metabolic systems, vegetal, animal, and human. So through a selective use of 6 metabolic elements, air, water, soil, vegetation, food, and waste, 12 student groups attempted critical design interventions revolving around these non-human materialities. Firstly, deconstructing the ORR as an infrastructural object, and subsequently reconstituting the very essence of its ecological role through these metabolic entities. So in the next few slides, I'll just show very quickly the outputs that came out of the studio. So basically it was 6 metabolic elements and 12 groups. So 2 groups were working on the same element, and it was quite interesting how sometimes they came with very contrasting interpretations as well. So this was the group on air, where the one group used the theme of pollution and another group used the theme of pollination. And so the way they thought about the ORR's own metabolic character around air itself was interesting. So in terms of pollution, in terms of pollution, their architectural interpretation was this singular object, which was like a air pollution quality monitor, but it became kind of a mega object that would compete for interest with the ORR's own scale itself. Whereas the group on pollination was very much interested in the construction of habitats alongside the ORR, which would call attention towards the pollination of bees. It was a major migratory bird corridor, and other kinds of animal circulations. And so their interventions were in scaling down the ORR, whereas this particular group wanted to celebrate the mega scale of the ORR. So scale itself became quite interesting in the way these 6 metabolic actants or agents were used not for any kind of precise reading, but more for capturing the atmospheric qualities of landscape, mostly through imagined and ultimately, if possible, redesigned proposals. And this was again something that I was keen with the studio, that if they wanted to come up with very particular forms of architectural solutions, they could, but if they wanted to come up with very open-ended interventions, then that was also okay, because for instance, with the group on soil, their analysis showed how there was a varied sense of soil typologies cutting through, that the ORR cut through. So it went from loamy soil to clay, it went from loamy soil to clayey soil to rocky to different kinds of soil prototypes, which meant that, and this idea of, and I think in the brief you mentioned that, John, about the substrates of infrastructure, and that's what this group was very much interested in, excavating the substrates of infrastructure and what kind of soil typologies existed underneath the infrastructure. And so one group was revealing the process of sedimentation, and the other group was interested in recomposting infrastructure through these different soil types. And both of them did not come with any kind of interventions, but they were just signposting what lies underneath the infrastructure is not just utilities, but this substrate of soil as well. This is the third group on food, which again was quite interesting and compares with Marco's, overlaps with Marco's presentation on urban farming, because what they found with the ORR is the way it cuts through wetlands that were essentially used for agricultural practices that would be very seasonal. And so for them, it was the temporality of farming and food practices that became crucial. And translating that into a time-based speculation meant that this particular group erected these food pillars on the ORR, which was calling attention to the seasonality of farming activities. So as the seasons changed, the boards would change and remark on what kind of agricultural practices would be prevalent in the area itself. And another group was just interested in identifying how the underneath spaces, again the meanwhile spaces, could be reanimated through informal food practices. So some of them were very conventional kind of solutions, and others would be a bit more heterodox, and it ranged from a spectrum of time to space, and that was again something that as architectural students they tried to grapple with. This is the group on water. This group was really talking about the history of water systems in the area, And another group was really interested in how ORR as an engineering marvel also tampered with the hydrology of the region and what could be done through the same hydraulic processes to find a balance again between the hydraulic engineering intervention and the hydrology, natural hydrology of the area. So again, this was much more analytical rather than coming up with any kind of precise architectural solutions. I probably won't go too much into the details. This is again on vegetation, which did a wonderful inventory of vegetation typologies along the ORR, and this was a very architectural solution of a biome lacustrine that they came up with as a proposal to be as a architectural placemaking exercise on the side of the ORR, and this group was really into identifying all the different kinds of green typologies that you can find in the region. And finally, this was the group on waste, which again, one group was thinking in terms of a scrapyard museum because of the way ORR had changed the entire area into a wasteland of a new variety. Another group tried to rethink its history of wastelands, this scrublands that was reconfigured as wastelands by excavating parts of the areas around the way, alongside the ORR, to think in terms of a eco park and a landfill. So very different kinds of analytical filters that were used to come with using the metabolic elements to not just metaphorically but also literally rethink the ORR. So here design employs metabolism not only to apprehend biophysical processes in their transformative sense, but also to think about the possibilities of reimagining the ecological character of the ORR. So, at one level, this might seem like visual thinking or even dangerous in terms of simply re-erecting nature as an artifact or subduing infrastructure like ORR into an eco-friendly object. And that's what most of the time happens through an exercise like this. So the rematerialization of infrastructure in this manner was not to be going against the province of the natural or the physical world, but to allow us to attempt transforming a seemingly techno-engineered object such as the ORR into some kind of an organizing design for a more sustainable form of ecological imagination. So at the very beginning, we looked at some, like typical of any architectural design processes, studio processes, you look for precedents, and we looked at how a scale of the ORR, and at that time it was a 30-kilometer long road, phase 2 hadn't been implemented. How do we think about it in terms of ecological imagination? Do we look at the ecology only on the side of the ORR, or you overlap ecology on top of the ORR, you look underneath? And so we looked at some of the precedent images that could be used. And here, literally, I encourage the students to visually engage with the aesthetics of the ORR. So this is one powerful image where flamingos are birds known to come for migration into Chennai in the winter seasons. And so, what would happen if an infrastructural element like the ORR becomes reveals the migratory corridors of flamingos, and it becomes part of their habitat. And so when we initially explored these precedents of image production, we did it cautiously as an ecological ethos might offer a different regime of value and meaning to the ORR, one that is definitely generative, but then by embedding it in the ecosystem of its surrounding landscape, what you try to reduce is this histories of conflict, because by overemphasizing these histories of conflict, you don't offer easy or straightforward alternatives to something that can be probably more collective, harmonious, or tending towards an equilibrium. And that's what I was interested in. Can the ORR achieve a state of equilibrium with its surrounding nature? So even if we wanted to encourage the beginning of a new ecology, that this optic of an architectural design studio reveals the ability of design to be telescopic as well as stratified in terms of layering. It's able to slide across different scales and systems to embrace not just interdisciplinary but also transboundary collaborations. And for architectural students, it was quite a challenge. as their initial critical analysis stage showed, such an approach places infrastructure as landscape in a territory of new scales, systems, and synergies that traverses a gradient of local to regional economies. The ability of design is not so much in terms of providing hard or soft solutions, fixed or flexible, but about developing a new morphological as well as topological vocabulary for the infrastructural landscape based on notions of flows, circulations, and exchanges. So, instigated by an ecological imperative, the platform of the studio rises up to the challenge of exploring interventions that simply do not impose biological metaphors on infrastructural systems or try to pass off biophysical processes that can be repackaged as infrastructures. So this was like a whole series of analytical diagrams that they undertook before they came up with these interventions. And so some of these analytical diagrams were around analysis of wind directions in terms of landscape typologies. And so you have this the kind of architectural processes that were quite present and intact during this charrette. But still, they found it was revalorized in new ways and directions, and that was quite interesting for me. And at this point, I offered very little guidance. The students really took over the process. And in the end, what we came up with this idea of rethinking the ORR as a metabolic infrastructure, and the way we used metabolism here departs from this Marxist understanding of metabolism that geographers have precised, one that is predetermined by these political economic processes, and instead of looking at infrastructure through a metabolic lens, multiplies the potential sites of infrastructure, intervention, widening the objects of analysis and the epistemology of social change. So it was about resisting the projection of ORR as an ugly artifact that needs to be humanized or beautified. And the ecological imagination here is not about just an ideology or utopia, or what Antoine Picot has referred to as the imaginary practical entities, where practices and imagination are in constant interaction. And so, following the exemplar of, or rather rejecting the exemplar of ecological design that is most commonly pursued in landscape design studios, what these students did was look for unorthodox tools where identifying metabolism as a methodological starting point tackles what Bruno Latour has referred to as the great questions of ecology. So it's not about resorting to any kind of self-referential green solutions, and of course you can't resist some of these popular or literal framings. So, waste as detritus, water as hydrology, food as biota were all terms that seeped constantly into the studio discussions. But the idea of recomposing the ORR as a conduit for these 6 metabolic elements was not only to animate it through the movement of vehicles, but also birds, sediments, plants, waste, water, food, etc. And so in that sense, I think it was quite a successful exercise for me, because the ORR is encouraged to reimagine its own ecological complicity with its regional landscape in a more generative manner. And in that sense, I was able to leave this overt critique of social science behind and to absorb the critical thinking, a process of critical thinking that architectural design offered me. And methodologically, I found it to be a much more fulfilling exercise. So I'll stop right there. Thank you.